It's the Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent. Yesterday was Election Day, and we were at the polls.
I vote because at the end of the day, you can't complain if you don't vote. I expect certain things from the government, and I want the people to be in play who can support the things that I expect.
I'm excited to see people speaking out about the corporate money flooding into our local elections and state elections and DTE and big corporations that are trying to influence votes.
I don't think the race would be that close, but I think it's important to have candidates who believe in our free markets, and there's one on the Democratic side who doesn't, so here I am.
Even though I still vote, but see, I don't believe any of them can do what they say, because if they vote off, our country wouldn't be the way it is.
So we need people that's going to fight for us because, we are the people. And we have to understand that we all are in this together, and stop fighting against one another because we are the 99%.
Those were the voices of Moray Mercer in Detroit, Gerard Moranzik in Warren, Jerry Smithstein in Detroit, Jay Lovelady in Detroit, and Yvette Hodges in Warren. Michigan primaries usually come and go, with most people not voting. They're low profile, they're in August, and turnout tends to land somewhere around a quarter of registered voters. Last night was different. Over 1.5 million ballots were counted in the Democratic Senate primary alone. That's more than any non-presidential Democratic primary in this state going back to at least 1998. That race between Haley Stevens and Abdul El-Sayed is the most expensive Democratic Senate primary in history. And the race was just called for El-Sayed. We'll get into it later in the show, and we'll hear from someone pushing for more socialist candidates. But first, what happened everywhere else on the ballot? State House and Senate races don't draw the money or the cameras, but they tell you at least as much about where both parties are heading. Zach Gorchow is president of Gongwer News Service of Michigan and has covered this state's politics for a long time. Zach, welcome back to the Metro.
Good to be with you, Robin.
You wrote on Twitter recently that this has been a Michigan primary season like no other. Why?
Well, I was mainly referring to the U.S. Senate race between Abdul El-Sayed and Haley Stevens. It really divided Michigan Democratic voters in a way that I have not seen before, where, party officials and political parties like to say that primaries are disagreements among friends. And I'm not sure that there's a lot of friends after this. I know there will obviously be a huge move to try to put Humpty Dumpty back together, starting today, with it appearing that Abdul El-Sayed is going to be the Democratic nominee by a very narrow margin. But there's a lot of bad feelings, and it's going to take a lot of work to put it back together. So that's largely what I was referring to. But I was also referring to this moment of truth for the Michigan Democratic Party and its voters around the state, that this was the kind of litmus test up and down the ballot, from U.S. Senate all the way on down to State House, where you had these traditional liberal Democratic candidates and many of these new upstart progressive candidates facing off with a real question of who speaks for the Democratic Party today.
Zach, how fortuitous that the race was just called moments before this show started. So we now have the results of this litmus test. What does it mean to you?
Boy, the Michigan Democratic Party has its hands full going into the general election, is what I would say. This was not, I don't think, terribly surprising that it ended up being so close. But when you're talking about a 15,000 vote margin out of about 1.5 million votes cast, that is really, really close. I think it says that we don't have if we were looking for a clear answer on what your baseline Democratic voter wants in its statewide candidates, I don't know that we have it.
Yeah.
Clearly, it appears Abdul El Sayed is going to be the winner. But I think his side had certainly been projecting that this was poised to be a landslide statement type victory. And he didn't get that. Now but it is historic. I mean, let's not underestimate this. I mean, this is going to be the first practicing Muslim to win a major statewide race like this. This is a victory by a candidate over $60 million in funds spent against him in a race, outspent 10-1. This is a big deal and shouldn't be underestimated. But I don't know that from this race, I don't know that we got a clear answer. I do think the progressives notched a number of significant victories elsewhere on the ballot.
They did indeed, and we're about to get into that as well. But I mean, because of this narrow victory for El Sayed, what you're saying is that there are a lot of questions left unanswered. And certainly the opponents of El Sayed, some of them have said Haley Stevens would have had an easier road to win the general election over Mike Rogers. What do you think about that?
I mean, Haley Stevens fits the mold of your traditional Democratic candidate in a competitive race, kind of, center left, out of Oakland County. You know, she's not as gifted, a politician as people like Alyssa Slotkin or Debbie Stabenow. But I think she, certainly did, I think, a little better than people expected. Now, some may say, hey, you had, over $60 million spent on your behalf. How do you not win? You actually underperformed. And I think that's a fair argument too. What I think we don't know right now is El Sayed had a ton of negative advertising spent against him. So it's not surprising that right now he seems to be polling worse against Mike Rogers than Haley Stevens. Now we're going to see what happens once some negative advertising starts to hit Mike Rogers, if that evens things up. But I do think, look, Michigan Democrats have not nominated a pure progressive like this for a major statewide office in 60 years. So this is a big test.
Sure. And that's the last point that I want to get into about this race. I mean, El Sayed is someone who wants Medicare for all. If he wins the general election, how might that change the politics in the state of Michigan? I mean, will it bring out more economic populists to run in more local state house and Senate races, do you think?
Well, I do think one thing that this and other races, several other races, could change in Michigan and this is something that Abdul El Sayed campaigned heavily on, the idea of getting money out of politics. I mean, you think about it. Abdul El Sayed overcomes $60 million in spending. John James beats Perry Johnson in the Republican primary for governor, and Perry Johnson spent more than $30 million. Donovan McKinney unseats Sri Tanadar despite getting massively outspent. And there are other races like this that maybe this idea that you can spend your way to victory, or that a huge spending advantage is a huge advantage in getting votes. I think that has taken a huge hit yesterday. And that, now obviously, El Sayed, he needs to win in the fall. But even if he were to lose, I do think he and others have won a significant victory in the idea that you can't win if you get massively outspent, because these three candidates just did.
Okay, so what you're saying is that this primary race in some ways was a referendum against big money in politics.
It was, look, the messaging didn't resonate enough. I mean, clearly some of the spending by these outside groups against El Sayed had an impact. Otherwise, this race wouldn't have been so close. But Haley Stevens appears to have lost. And that's a huge deal. That, we heard this from a lot of voters saying, I'm sick of the money. I'm sick of the ads. People are tuning it out. Perry Johnson ran a zillion ads criticizing John James, calling him a lying liberal loser. Well, John James won by 15, 16 points. Sri Tanadar overwhelmingly outspent Donovan McKinney. And it appears McKinney won by a pretty healthy margin, 4 percentage points. So, this I think is something of a victory for the idea that you can win with a grassroots movement against massive spending.
And what ties into that as well is an affordability message, right? I mean, that is something that many of these candidates have been pushing. For some Republicans, that's meant cutting red tape and government waste. For some Democrats, it's meant taking a populist bent, pledging to fight enemies like DTE, Blue Cross, Blue Shield, data centers, I guess I should say perceived enemies. Do you think that's a fair reading of the events yesterday?
Well, I mean, Haley Stevens was everybody's talking about affordability. And because the race was so close, I don't know that we got a clear, if Abdul had won by 8, 9, 10, 12 points, we'd be saying, boy, the Democratic Party, the baseline Democratic voter is all in on Medicare for all. Clearly, almost half of the electorate appears to be in on it, but there's not a mandate from Democrats for that. So I don't know that we got a clear answer on that, other than that everybody agrees everything is too expensive and something needs to be done about it. I mean, that's pretty clear, but the answer, what the solutions are, I don't know that there's a consensus on that right now. I mean, from the Republican standpoint, John James was talking about affordability too, but more from a standpoint of like, let's cut waste out of government so we can cut taxes. There's a totally different approach to the solution.
It's the Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent. My guest is Zach Gorchow. He's the president of Gongwer News Service of Michigan and co-host of WDET's State Politics podcast, Mishmash. We're discussing yesterday's primary races and what it says about the changing priorities of the Democratic and Republican parties in our state. Zach, one of the biggest races for Republicans is for the governor's office. John James is facing off against Perry Johnson. What does it tell you that John James won?
Well, I think it says this is a little bit different than what we were just talking about. But look, I think it's two things. One, John James is very popular in the Michigan Republican Party. He has had over $100 million spent on him in elections over the last 4 to 5 cycles now. And I just don't think Perry Johnson ever resonated. I talked to a lot of different groups going into this cycle, into this election, and he just did not catch fire. All the spending and whatnot, you've got to be somebody who people can relate to. And I just don't think Perry Johnson was able to do that. John James was, and I think that's why he was able to win despite this fusillade of spending against him.
And John James has President Trump's endorsement. Does that mean that he still has a really strong hold over the state party, President Trump?
Well, I think the answer is yes. It was pretty clear once Trump endorsed James. John James was the front runner from the jump. And these other candidates who were running, they were all just hoping against hope that Trump would either stay out of the race or endorse one of them. And then when Trump endorsed James, it just felt like any chance that one of these other candidates had a shot ended. And I think it's pretty clear Trump's hold on the state party is still very strong, particularly when it comes to a statewide primary. We have seen Republican conventions go against his picks, but that's a very narrow universe of activists.
Zach, here's what I'm wondering. Jocelyn Benson, who won the Democratic primary, from folks I've spoken with, she doesn't seem to inspire a great deal of political passion, let's say. So this has me wondering, what do you think John James' chance is of winning in the general?
Well, I would say, I understand that Jocelyn Benson doesn't, come across as somebody who's going to set the world on fire necessarily. But my goodness, you do wonder, she's probably hearing this saying, what more do I have to do? I just won the Democratic primary with more than 80% of the vote. And I do think we need to say, this was a tremendous performance by Benson. She chased every viable Democrat out of the primary. Mike Duggan didn't even make it to the filing deadline. And she wins the nomination massively.
Zach, could
The
I jump
Democrat,
in for one
yes, go
moment
ahead.
just because you have invoked Mike Duggan's name here? And I have heard a lot of conversations of people lamenting him dropping out and saying that they think he would have done really well in this race. And I just quickly, before we move past this race in particular, I'm wondering your thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, I don't, if it had been a Jocelyn Benson versus Mike Duggan race for the Democratic nomination, based on the climate in the Democratic Party right now, I think I feel pretty confident Jocelyn Benson would have won that race. She would have been the more leftward candidate of the two. And in this era where, like, big money in politics is a problem, I think that would have been very hard for Mike Duggan, who was much more of a centrist, to overcome in a Democratic primary. Jocelyn Benson is, I think, pretty clearly the favorite going into this race against John James. I haven't looked at the final numbers, but I mean, there's roughly 1.5 million votes cast in the Democratic primary for governor to about maybe a million in the Republican primary for governor. That is an unbelievable gap. There has been a massive enthusiasm advantage for the Democrats, and there continues to be. And those numbers, I'm sure Republicans are looking at that and thinking, "Oh no, we're in big trouble here." And right now, Benson has basically been able to. She moved through this primary unscathed. John James got beat up quite a bit by Perry Johnson, and now Benson, who preserved all her resources, is is clearly the favorite going into this race between resources, not having had a glove laid on her so far, and the environment.
Okay, and back to the Trump effect before we move on. So again, President Trump endorsed John James. Trump is not a popular person right now. I mean, he got us into a very unpopular war in Iran. Prices have continued to go up. He's slapped painful tariffs on Canada, and he's made billions of dollars while in office. Do you think, is there a world where perhaps come November where his endorsement of John James could actually hurt him?
I mean, look, the president is very unpopular. His negative ratings are over 60% or roughly 60%. And whether Trump endorsed James or not, the two have always been kind of tied at the hip. John James has always embraced and supported President Trump. And look, in a midterm where President Trump is deeply unpopular, it's a big problem. That being said, Republican candidates, they have no choice right now. If they do not embrace Trump, they cannot get through a primary. You can't get to the general without being tied, supporting the president, getting his endorsement. And now the other side of that comes in where John James is going to have to carry that. And it's a problem. There's no two ways about it.
Okay, Zach, we started by discussing progressives in the Democratic Party because they've been making waves and potentially restructuring what the party looks and sounds like in Michigan. Several economic populists have made the inroads. Abdul El-Sayed, as we have discussed, just won the primary. Will Lawrence won his primary for the 7th Congressional District. As we noted, in the state Senate, Abbas Alawiya won. In the state House, Chris Gilmer Hill won his primary. Donovan McKinney just beat Shri Tanadar for the 13th Congressional District. Okay, so given that list, how might economic populist candidates reshape Lansing into the future?
Well, I think there's the big question is who wins control of the Michigan House of Representatives? It's currently a Republican majority. If it stays Republican, I think we'll see this progressive, bigger progressive contingent become a very loud voice at the Capitol. That will largely be the voice of the opposition. However, if the Democrats were to win the majority, I think I would anticipate a very serious conversation about who the next Speaker of the House is. Ranjiv Puri is the current minority leader and would certainly be considered the favorite to be the next Speaker of the House. However, I would fully expect a very robust discussion in the next House Democratic caucus about whether a true blue progressive should be the next speaker based on these results. I'm sure that's a conversation that's going to be had among Democrats in the House today. Over in the Senate, the likely next Senate Democratic leader, and if Democrats maintain the Senate, which I think they're favored to, Darren Camilleri is somebody who is pretty skilled at walking both those worlds and is, he's a huge supporter of Abdul El-Sayed, and I think would likely, is well positioned to be a voice for that movement. So I do see a much, whereas in the past, the progressives have been kind of, they've had a hard time getting their position to be the position of the Democratic caucus in the House and Senate. It is very possible that they're going to be much bigger players. Somebody like Dylan Wegela, a DSA candidate.
Sure, we just had him
state
on the
rep
show.
from Garden City.
Yeah.
He's been kind of a little bit of a lonely voice in the wilderness. Well, he's got a lot of company coming now. And I think somebody like Dylan, Representative Wegela, is likely to, somebody like that could have a much more significant role in the 103rd legislature.
Okay, last one for you. Then do you see it possible that some progressive momentum could help Democrats take the state house?
Well, I would say no. The races that will decide control of the state house, by and large, these are not progressive candidates. These are more centrist, center-left, traditional Democratic candidates, because these are in 50-50 areas. These are areas in places like Battle Creek and Albion, places like Jackson and Chelsea and Jackson County, downriver, places where generally, you tack more toward the middle to try to win. Now, somebody like Jamie Churches, who's going to be the Democratic candidate in a downriver seat, it's a really interesting race. She's a very progressive candidate, and she's up against someone I'd consider to be kind of a turning point USA conservative Republican and the incumbent Riley Linting. But by and large, these, the Democrats who will determine whether their party controls the House are more center-left, traditional liberal Democrats.
Zach, so what you're saying is that moderate Democrats are not going to enjoy the riches of the momentum that progressive Democrats are creating. In other words, voters are seeing the distinction.
Well, yeah, you're just talking about different breeds of Democratic voters. Look, in the city of Detroit, the east side of Detroit that elected or nominated Donovan McKinney, these are different Democrats than those in Battle Creek, Northern Calhoun County, and Albion. It's just there's a reason why Haley Stevens did so well among rural Democrats in more rural areas. And those are, in large part, in many ways, the kind of Democrats these candidates in competitive districts will be appealing to.
Zach Gorchow is the president of Gongwer News Service of Michigan and co-host of the Mishmash podcast. Zach, thank you so much for joining me on the Metro.
Hey, great to be with you. Thanks for the work you do.
It's the Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent. Up next, as we've been discussing, progressive candidates have been making inroads in this primary. We're going to talk about why and whether Michiganders are ready for economic populism. That's next. Stay with us.